Domestic violence is an issue that's been receiving increased attention over the past several decades. We're going to explore the topic a little on today's trigger warning. Intimate partner violence has been an issue that humankind has dealt with throughout history. Even today, with codified laws in nearly every developed country on the planet, there are millions upon millions of both perpetrators and victims. If anything, this has made it clear that despite laws to the contrary, it's a trend that will likely continue well past our own age. But in regards to the current legal atmosphere on domestic violence, was it ever legal? One of the most popular textbooks in modern women's study courses, Women, A Feminist Perspective, states that the popular expression rule of thumb originated from English common law, which allowed a husband to beat his wife with a whip or stick no bigger in diameter than his thumb. The husband's prerogative was incorporated into American law. Several states had statutes that essentially allowed a man to beat his wife without interference from the courts. This law was claimed to have been included in Blackstone's 1768 codification of the English common law. Despite the popularity of the textbook and the repeated use of the reference in mass media since, it appears that the reality was far different. While modern nations were developing, there may not have been laws explicitly dealing with intimate partner violence, but it was not due to beating one's wife being legal. Rather, this was because domestic violence was treated in much the same fashion as assault, and punished in much the same way. The codification of Blackstone's rule of thumb, it seems, had never actually occurred. British law since the 1700s and American laws predating the Revolution explicitly prohibited wife beating, though there may have been times and places where the law was indifferently enforced. You must also keep in mind that this was prior to frontier America, where there were a number of other laws that were treated with indifference and were incredibly difficult to enforce due to a number of factors, not the least of which the lack of rapid communication between communities and homesteads. Rather, the rule of thumb had, until more modern times, been explicitly used to refer to methods of measurement or estimation. It began being used metaphorically as early as the late 17th century. While there was, it seems, a little-known law that allowed a husband to chastise his wife, he could do no more to her than he might have done to an apprentice or employee. Still, domestic violence remains a problem, right up until today. But the atmosphere surrounding domestic violence shifted during the era of the civil liberties movement. In Chiswick, London in 1971, a woman named Erin Pitsey started an organization called the Chiswick Women's Aid, opening the world's first shelter for women and children to escape domestic violence. It was a milestone in understanding and dealing with domestic violence and a refuge for female victims and their children. Despite hostility from English authorities, Pitsey was determined to help bring light to the cause of overcoming domestic violence, and over the years opened a number of other shelters. In 1979, the organization became a recognized charity and was renamed Chiswick Family Rescue. The change of name and classification as a recognized charity brought a new set of challenges, some of them wholly unexpected. Unlike the politicians and feminists who were only too happy to use the charity's existence to support the plight of female victims of domestic violence, Pitsey realized that many of the women the charity was housing were every bit as violent as their partners, and in some cases, even more so. Domestic violence, it seemed, was reciprocal, with both partners abusing each other at rates that were close to parity. She soon discovered that most of the women in the shelter were as violent, and in some cases more violent than their partners. She co-authored a study with Dr. John Gayford entitled Comparative Study of Battered Women and Violence-Prone Women, in which she discovered that 62% of her sample population were prone to committing violence. Similar findings in later studies have supported this number, some suggesting that men were the victim in up to 70% of non-reciprocal violent relationships, where the woman was the sole aggressor. In a political atmosphere that was catering to the aftermath of the civil liberties movement, the suggesting that women could be abusers was anathema. She quickly lost support, and her studies and opinions faced sometimes violent backlash from angry militant feminists who refused to believe it. Pitsey claimed her cause had been hijacked by militant feminists. She received death threats against her, her children, and her grandchildren. She received harassment and bomb threats. She faced contingents of angry feminists screaming and heckling her at every speaking engagement. And then one night, her family dog was murdered That was the last straw. Pitsey then took her family and immigrated to the United States in 1982. She returned to the UK later that year to promote her new book, Prone to Violence, and reported that she was met with a solid wall of feminist demonstrators, carrying signs that read, "All men are rapists, all men are batterers." English police insisted that she have an escort during her book tour. And so the woman who had started the world's first battered women's shelter was now an enemy of feminism. Her name's not even mentioned in the history of the Chiswick family rescue. So why then was she met with such vitriol for suggesting that women could be just as capable of partner violence as men? Politics, it seems, and money. If Pitsey were able to open a shelter for battered men, it would take funding away from women's charities. In 1992, it was claimed, although I can't find the source, that Sandra Horley, director of Chiswick Family Rescue's new organization, Refuge, was quoted as having said, "If we put across the idea that the abuse of men is as great as the abuse of women, then it could seriously affect our funding." But Erin Pitsey isn't alone. Similar claims of harassment, death threats, and bomb threats were experienced by another female author of a book on domestic violence against men. Suzanne Steinmetz's book, The Battered Husband, received much the same treatment. In Canada, a man named Earl Silverman managed to, at long last, escape what he claimed was extreme violence at the hands of his ex-wife. After attempting to seek some kind of help for the violence he experienced, he was referred time and time again to anger management counseling, despite his protestations that he needed support, not anger management. He tried and could find no publicly funded support in Canada for male victims. He was left to seek support completely on his own. 17 years passed while he battled the demons left to him by his ex-wife, and he finally discovered his passion in MASH, the Men's Alternative Safe House, the only shelter in Canada designed to help male victims of domestic violence. It received no government funding. Not one penny of the millions upon millions of dollars allocated for women's shelters in Canada every year was offered to help Silverman in his cause. He ran the shelter out of pocket and helped many men escape and find a safe place to go to get away from their violent spouses. After 3 years, however, the cost of financing MASH weighed down, and Silverman was forced to shutter the operation. The very next day, he was found dead, hanging in a garage by his new roommate from an apparent suicide. In his 4-page suicide note, he blamed the government for not giving enough reverence to male victims of domestic violence. His death was mocked by feminists, who, despite the mountains of evidence of non-violent men becoming the victims of violent spouses, still cling to the notion that a man who bruises his knuckles while beating his wife is not a victim. While the statement itself is true, the cases aren't always that cut and dry. But ultimately, this is not to suggest that domestic violence against women is not a serious problem, because it is. But domestic violence against men is a serious problem as well. Even if we were to consider that the numbers provided by feminist researchers that 85% of domestic violence victims are female are true, they still receive 100% of the funding. Men in need have no options but to either continue their abuse or deal with it without outside support. In extreme cases, male victims of domestic violence are often painted as the perpetrator and arrested, indicted, and are sometimes lucky to get off with a 2-year conditional sentence pending the successful completion of unneeded anger management counseling sessions. Not only do I know men that this has happened to, but it's happened to me personally. But the question remains, are men the more common perpetrators of domestic violence? A study on family violence in Australia from 1997 suggests that the difference between male and female perpetrators and victims of domestic violence is not significant. And even so, the numbers of men reporting being victims of domestic violence was slightly higher than women, with 5.7% of men reporting violence versus 3.7% of women. Interestingly, the same study found that from their sample size of 1,700 people, 3.4% of men admitted to committing acts of violence against their female partners, while only 3.6% of women admitted the same. The disparity between men reporting being assaulted and women reporting that they have assaulted is the biggest difference in the study, suggesting that either the men are lying about the violence that they've received, or that the women did not believe that what they were doing was assault, likely due to the perception that men tend to be physically stronger on average. Another study done in the USA in 2007 suggested that out of all the relationships in their sample of nearly 12,000 people, reported that almost 24% of all relationships had some measure of violence involved. Of those, 49.7% of them were reciprocally violent, and of non-reciprocal violent relationships, women were the perpetrators in over 70% of cases. This study suggests that men, more often than not, did not hit back when their partners were violent. Then the question begs to be asked. In relationships of reciprocal violence, are both partners abusive? Or is it merely violently dysfunctional? What purpose does legal action against one partner over the other in such relationships actually serve? Further studies found results that were near symmetry with the ones I've already mentioned. But even more interesting are similar studies that explored the issue of domestic violence in gay and lesbian relationships found that overall the numbers were much the same. But looking more in depth found that between 5 to 15% of gay males had reported being battered by their partners, while between 22 and 46% of lesbians reported the same, according to various studies. Now, this isn't to suggest that male perpetrators of domestic violence should be treated with any less seriousness. Domestic violence is a crime, and due to the physical size and strength often conferred to men by an accident of birth, they are more commonly able to do serious, lasting damage to their partners. But that being said, this shouldn't excuse female perpetrators, as the psychological effects of being a victim of domestic violence are the same for both men and women. Both men and women suffer in situations when they are abused by their partners. In many cases, the victim is unable or unwilling to leave due to fears often conferred on them through psychological abuse by their partners. But the system, as it stands, is stacked to help women facing these issues, but more often than not turns a blind eye to men. The idea isn't to offer less support for women. The idea is to offer more symmetry in our understanding of how best to approach supporting victims of both genders. In early 2015, the Canadian Association for Equality unveiled a billboard in downtown Toronto that made the claim that half of domestic violence victims were males and that no shelters were dedicated to them, making mention of some of the statistics I've already provided. Critics proclaimed the billboard as sexist and rested on debunked statistics. I'd really like people to recognize the difference between the words denied and debunked, because there's a huge difference. Because the reality is that these statistics weren't debunked. The statistics, rather, were ignored in favor of statistics showing police-reported arrest rates. I just want to remind people that while the arrest statistics are no doubt true, they fail to take into consideration that the Canadian police tend to utilize the Duluth model, a policy that has its roots in the feminist patriarchy theory, positing that domestic violence is the result of patriarchal ideology in which men are encouraged and expected to control their partners. As such, in many situations such as my own, it is the male who is arrested and charged, even in cases where the male didn't do so much as lift a finger against his partner, in cases where the only physical action he took was to block a strike in self-defense, or even in cases where the female expressed concern that she might be in physical danger, often spurred on by the police victim services units themselves. And so it really doesn't take two brain cells to rub together to understand that yes, the police reported arrest rates are going to reflect that it is mainly males who are being arrested. But that's merely arrest rates, and that makes no mention of conviction rates. People often forget that the police are merely the arm of the judicial system and not the body itself. And thus, statistics provided by them should and must be held to a level of scrutiny to get a realistic picture of the situation. But even so, that doesn't matter in the context of the second part of the billboard. Even if 99% of the victims of domestic violence were women, it doesn't excuse that 100% of the support funding goes to help female victims. In fact, the only federal funding allotted to specifically deal with men is specifically funneled into anger management programs and rehabilitation, even in cases where they're the victim. There is no funding to help support men, either by shelters or by counseling. Now, domestic violence is and always will be a touchy subject, but it helps neither men or women to pretend that it's one-sided. So thanks for listening today, guys. I had initially wanted to put a list of phone numbers you can call in your own country if you are experiencing domestic violence, or if anybody you know is experiencing domestic violence. That is specifically gender neutral. However, I have heard too many cases where a man calling for help on a domestic violence hotline is referred to the abuser's aspect of it, and I don't think that's fair, so I don't want to put you through the stress of having to dial one of those numbers. However, if any of you do know of a hotline that is gender neutral, please let me know in the comments below. I will put it into the description so that people can get some help if they need it. So anyways, I hope you appreciated today's episode. If you did, be sure to click like, leave a comment if you agree or disagree, and by all means, hit the subscribe button. And if you, like me, have been the victim of domestic violence, whether male or female, please feel free to share your story. And remember, it can always get better, so just remain positive. Thanks.